Hi KRB teachers, welcome to week 7 in the Maximinds Mental Health Care webinar series. Today we are focusing on prevention and how you as teachers can set clear expectations. To start with, a trigger warning that we will be discussing things like mental illness and it may make reference to suicide. If you do find this distressing, please feel free to stop the video and also reach out for support. A reminder of the 8-part webinar series, and today is of course prevention. So starting with an introduction, what are we going to be learning about today? Firstly, what is prevention and why is it important? Secondly, how do you prevent mental illness in your students? Thirdly, what are clear expectations and how do you set them? And finally, some additional Maximinds tools and resources that you can use. So here is an outline of what we will be covering today. Starting with what is prevention. The World Health Organization defines prevention as approaches and activities aimed at reducing the likelihood that a disease or disorder will affect an individual, interrupting or slowing the process of the disorder or reducing disability. So what does this really mean? The key things we've pulled out here is that it's about reducing and interrupting or slowing the progress of disorder. So really starting before there's even a semblance of a disorder or disease coming, that is the aim to reduce it in the first place. So from that perspective and how we apply that at Maximinds, it's about slowing or minimizing the development of mental illness before it's even rears its head. The Australian Prevention Partnership Centre defines prevention as any action taken to keep people healthy and prevent or avoid risk of poor health, illness, injury, and early death. So in this instance, it's about not only avoiding the risk of that disorder or disease or poor health, but it's also about promoting health in the first place. So collectively, how we define prevention is really about reducing the likelihood of mental illness and disorders in the first place, but also about promoting healthy habits and ways of promoting mental health and well-being in the first place. A reminder that we looked at this, that mental health is not just the absence of mental illness, and vice versa, mental illness is not just the absence of mental health. So there's actually a dual continuum model such that you can have high mental health, but also high mental illness. And that would be when our students are struggling. On the flip side, you can also have low mental illness, but also low mental health. And that would be languishing. So ultimately, the goal is to help our students flourish by fostering a high sense of mental health and well-being in the first place, so that more pull towards the health and well-being, and also push away from having low mental illness in the first place. So collectively, that's how we look at prevention. A reminder that we also looked previously at what we already do for our physical health. So for instance, we all already go to the doctor, for instance, or the dentist for those checkups to help prevent physical illness from occurring even in the first place. And one analogy that I wanted to give you here, which is quite topical and obvious, is of course COVID-19 vaccinations. And that was a preventative measure and method to ensure that we would reduce the likelihood of developing COVID before it even happened. So it's about trying to prevent these things from occurring rather than having to fix them up later. So that's obviously the mandate for how we have had to deal with something quite recent altogether. So then in the same vein, what are we really doing to prevent mental illness? And that's just something for you to think about in terms of what you may already do personally for yourself, but also for your students, and why it's so important. I really like this analogy as well. Raise Foundation is an excellent organisation which mentors and supports young people, particularly girls all around Australia. they talk about an upstream intervention model as prevention. So the idea is that young people learn lifelong survival skills before they're even in that point of crisis, before they're even to the point of drowning. So as you can see, if we look at in the top right hand corner, a student that's already starting to show signs of mental illness, particularly, what can we do to help them at that point to intervene and help prevent them flowing downstream to the stage that they start developing mental illness, and of course the worst case scenario in resulting in things like suicide. So further to that, why is prevention so important? As we looked at from the start intro session with you about 7 weeks ago now, you can see that there is too many suicides happening in our young people in not only Australia, but in Sydney, in eastern school suburbs, private girls' schools. This is something we're aiming to prevent, because when this happens, and that's the worst case scenario that does develop, there can be measures that have been put in place earlier, such as doing these sorts of webinars and learning more about mental illness and disorders before it gets to the stage where we've lost students and their lives because of things like mental illness. To reinforce that, as we've seen, suicide is the biggest killer of young Australians. That is bigger than car crashes, that's bigger than any other form of accidents. It's the single biggest killer. And today alone, one young person will take their life. And as we're going to continue to explore, 50% of young people will have a mental disorder, the prediction is, by 2030. So really, we want to prevent that worst case scenario of suicide, and we want to be on the front foot and be prepared to deal with and help young people with mental illness because of the increasing rate that it's occurring, to the point that 1 in 2 in every classroom of yours will have a mental illness in 5-7 years. There's also academic benefits of promoting mental health and well-being and trying to reduce the rates of mental illness and disorders in the classroom. So as you can see here, the average number of absent school days in students greatly differs between those that have a mental illness and those that don't. So if they do have a mental illness, they will be away for 5 weeks of the school academic year. 5 weeks is a long time to be missing out on school because of mental illness. So it's really impacting the girls in the classroom. That compared to 2 weeks for those without a mental illness disorder. So as you can see, it's 2.5 times the rate of absenteeism for students with mental illness. That obviously has huge impacts for you as teachers when you're trying to teach content, and you need students, of course, to be in the room and present in order to help them. Further to that, Year 9 students in Australia, this was done a study in Victoria through Monash University. Those students with a mental disorder are up to, as you can see, almost 3 academic years as a result of mental illness disorder behind their peers with no mental illness disorder. So they're hugely impacted, not only in being away from the class, but ultimately that perpetuates and leads to them being behind in school years, which of course is not going to help them to be not only engaged, but excel and be meeting the minimum criteria and performance needs, and ticking off the syllabus that they need to actually learn if they have a mental illness disorder. But the good news is mentally healthy students have better outcomes in the academic sense. These include a reduction in off-task and disruptive behaviours in the classroom. Particularly, we would see this in the case of students with, for instance, ADHD. They also have increased time for teaching and learning, as we saw, 2.5 times more present in the classroom than those that don't have it. They're also found to be more engaged learners, improved learning outcomes, and ultimately increased attention to and completion of academic tasks. Ultimately, we believe prevention is so important at Maxi Minds because rather than reacting to crises, we can proactively intervene as we go. So in this case, when we're reactive, it's not only costly, not only to the school, for instance, but also the parents. It's also timely, and it's also very energy sapping for you, as you may already know as teachers, the effort that needs to go into dealing and managing and reacting rather than being proactive, which is, of course, saves time, energy, and money by helping to develop that from the start. I've showed you this before, and this is further to that statistic that the prediction is to rise, mental illnesses to rise in our young people, ultimately to 1 in 2. So we're looking at how mental illness disorders for the 16 to 24-year-olds will rise, the hypothesis from now, which is 2 in 5, to 3 in 5 within 7 years. So really, as for you as teachers, it's going to be, unfortunately, more of the norm rather than the exception is having students with mental illness in the classroom. So how can we really be on the front foot and helping to prevent that before it rears its head? So we'll start with going into prevention strategies and how do you actually as teachers help to prevent mental illness and also obviously promote mental wellbeing. I say recap because we've already covered quite a lot of this in the previous webinars, and I'll show you how that's been done. So key strategies here are educating yourself on mental health and mental illness. Also learning to identify the warning signs of mental illness in students. Furthermore, developing the rapport and strong connections with students. And finally, increasing your own self-awareness and authoritative teaching styles. So of course, educating yourself on mental health, we've covered from webinar 1, and we looked at really what is mental health from the perspective of children and people. So a recap and a reminder that it's helping to encourage students to be in the present, in control with their workloads, and also in touch with reality. We looked at some strategies in week 1 as to how to do that. And if you do want to recap, please feel free to go back and watch that. But at a high level, those things in the first instance are doing a huge amount to help prevent mental illness. In week 2, of course, you educate yourself on what is mental illness. And so we looked at the difference between, for instance, mental health and how we define mental illness as instead of being focused on the present, students may tend to focus more on the past or on the future. They also may feel more helpless. And they also may be more of a delusional rather than realistic space in terms of their perceptions. How can you prevent then mental illness? It's about encouraging students and checking and listening to them when they're mentioning things that have already happened or they're worrying about what's down the track, what's going to happen for the year 12 trials when they're still in year 10. What are they going to do after school when they've still got to get through year 12, for instance? So while those things are good to think about, if you notice them exacerbated on an extreme level, any fixation on any past or present, that's something to keep in mind, which we can catch that and help prevent that earlier. Also a sense of helplessness. So you'd want to help listen for and identify when students may feel like they don't have much in their own control. So they may develop what we call as learned helplessness. So they feel like it doesn't matter what they do, they're still getting the same marks. They're not necessarily feeling like they can improve despite trying. And finally, also listening out for things that aren't necessarily realistic. So their interpretations potentially of what's happening in the classroom, it could be amongst friends and peers, and that you would see this come up as things like taking things out of context, not necessarily remembering, reflecting what actually happened in situations, and also noticing that there may be some, almost off interpretation of what has happened. So preventing those three things, particularly from happening, can also help with lowering the incidence and ongoing development of, for instance, mental illness. We also looked at the most common mental illnesses in teenage girls. So by you knowing what sorts of illnesses there are and what are the particular symptoms, that can also help to prevent the exacerbation of these mental illnesses, not only developing, but also perpetuating and exacerbating. I would suggest also going back to week 2 to remind yourself of what these sorts of symptoms are and how they're experienced by students, so that you're across those, but also reflecting on if you notice any students even now having any of those symptoms. Again, we're looking at that upstream and how we can help prevent before these illnesses become worsened. So further to that, learning to actually identify what are the specific warning signs of mental illness. This is obviously going to help for when you're knowing what to look out for, so that we can actually prevent and have that early intervention from the start. We looked at general warning signs. So for you, a reminder of knowing to look out for things like mood, concentration, energy levels, social interactions, academics, eating and exercise, physical symptoms, risk-taking, being overwhelmed, esteem, challenges, and motivation. A reminder that these were things you're looking for as changes, particularly, not only within themselves, but also differences between students and how you would expect, for instance, a Year 8 student generally to perform. Specifically to that, the warning signs for each of the mental illnesses to look out for, to therefore prevent. For anxiety, it's particularly associated with things like mood, concentration, energy, physical and appearing overwhelmed. Depression, mood, concentration, physical, energy, eating and exercises, and changes in that, esteem and motivation. For ADHD, looking out for concentration challenges, which would suggest inattentive and more physical and fidgeting symptoms, and warning signs which are more associated with being hyperactive or impulsive, and or social challenges. For conduct disorder, things like associated with social risk-taking and impacts on academics. And finally, of course, eating disorders, looking out for social, physical, esteem, and eating and exercise. Moving on to how you can help develop rapport and strong connections with students. We looked at how you can help to identify and promote strengths, interests, and values in your students. So really helping to listen out for what are they good at, what are they interested in above and beyond at school, but also within school, certain topics, certain subjects, and also, of course, values, and how they are not only KRB's values and how to promote those, but also endorsing their own values. This can also help to prevent mental illness, because when we are focused on students and really connecting with them and hearing what are they passionate about, what are they really good at, and what do they truly value and are principled by, these things can help promote self-esteem, confidence, which of course is very important for trying to early promote mental health and well-being, but also early detect things like depression. And fourthly, mental illness can be prevented by increasing your own self-awareness as teachers and fostering an authoritative teaching style. As we looked at last week, we explored the 4 main teaching styles, which differ in terms of the level of control and warmth that you exert and foster in the classroom. So naturally, the gold standard is, of course, an authoritative teaching style, which is denoted by a high level of control on your behalf, but also high warmth. So this is typically firm but fair teaching. Class discussions are common and students are happy to speak up and contribute, and therefore you have more likely to have engaged students. In terms of preventing mental illness, the high warmth that you exert, and therefore the greater sense of empathy, rapport, non-judgment, and the psychologically safe environment helps students to feel like they are secure and safe and supported in their classroom environment. Similarly, a high level of control and that dominance that you have actually as a teacher, as the head figure, provides a lot of structure, routine, and clarity, which is also great for students because it takes away the ambiguity and the lack of certainty, which is typical when we think about mental illness, such as anxiety as the most common type of mental illness, and helps students to then feel themselves more in control and also feel like they know what's happening and they've got a good structure and routine. We will look specifically about how you can exert this level of high control shortly in terms of setting clear expectations and what that means, and also how you can do that. But ultimately for students, the benefits of having an authoritative teaching style are higher self-esteem and confidence. As mentioned, they have the opportunity and feel more comfortable speaking up, contributing. As role modeled by you and that greater warmth, they therefore have better emotional quotient and consequently excellent social skills. So they not only are more comfortable contributing and speaking in class, they have more settled relationships and with their peers, but also therefore they're more able to contribute and raise the alarm bells if they're feeling certain feelings or emotions. They're more likely to talk to you or someone else about that. So beyond those prevention strategies we've already explored in previous webinars, and to summarise, there's 3 additional prevention strategies that I would like to give you now. Firstly, it's how to empower not only yourself, but also students to take action and access that self-help. How do you also help to encourage healthy habits? And also finally, as mentioned, the setting clear expectations with students. So a reminder, we have spoken about the influence of both nature and nurture on fostering not only a sense of mental health and well-being in students, but also eradicating or at least minimizing the instance of mental illness. So for you as teachers, of course, nurture is where you have a huge role to play. And I can't stress this enough that as teachers, the way you set up the environment, foster that experience at school has such a positive influence on them in being role models to set up those healthy habits and promote their mental well-being, but also can help to try and minimize those instances of mental illness. In particular, and as KRB already promotes extensively, is of course the growth mindset. So encouraging that even if you may have different uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the mentality that they can overcome these, and this is a hurdle and a challenge to overcome, not necessarily a total roadblock. This is something they can learn from and grow. In the same vein, promoting not only in yourself and role modeling resilience and grit, but also helping to promote that in students so that they know that obstacles in terms of their emotional well-being and thoughts and feelings, they can be overcome. That really helps to set up healthy mindsets and also helps to prevent the instance of mental illness in the first place. So I also want to remind you that the young people's sources of information and ultimately influence are internet, friends, and then thirdly, the school and of course yourselves as teachers. as you'll see, this is above and beyond even what parents have in terms of the information and influence for students. So just to remind you of how pivotal your role is in being a role model and influencing the way that students make healthy choices to promote their mental well-being, particularly sleep, diet, and exercise. And so these may feel like they're more things for at home or parents to deal with, but as you as teachers, as you can see, you have a huge influence in even influencing how these happen outside just the classroom. So in terms of sleep, it's about noticing early on if any students may be fatigued or tired, if they may not seem quite themselves, their energy levels are changing, for instance. Of course, that's going to help not only them psychologically, but also academically to be able to focus and concentrate in class to absorb what you're teaching them. Diet, if you're on lunchtime duty, for instance, at recess and lunch, have you noticed any students that may have a difference or change in their consumption? Are they eating way more or way less than they were? How does that compare, for instance, to their peers in the same level? And also exercise. So this is not just for the PE teachers, this is also as teachers being able to talk about extracurricular activities and what sorts of sports they may be engaged in, or extra forms of exercise or even movement they do. So are they walking dog even, or they walk to school? So these three things are the most important as a prevention tool, not only to promote obviously physical well-being, but also mental well-being, because the endorphins that come from things like, for instance, exercise, or the energy that comes from the diet, and the rest and recovery that comes from sleep are all very important things to help prevent and notice prevent mental illness, but also help promote mental well-being in students. And as that final additional prevention strategy to teach you as teachers, it's looking at setting clear expectations with students. So firstly, what are clear expectations? So not to labour the point, but clear is making it very clear in terms of what's comprehensible, easy to understand, and student tailored. So for you as teachers, you potentially teach one subject, and that student also would have another at least 5 or 6 at a minimum other subjects that they have to also absorb a huge amount of information every day into their brains, which is of course very cognitively overloading. So the simpler you can make those expectations, the better for them. So then expectations, what are those? They're the goals, outcomes, and end products. These may be set by you yourself in terms of the classroom and what you do expect, but also what does NESA and the New South Wales Board of Education expect as the student develops throughout different years. So ultimately, it's a partnership between you and teachers, you and students. You yourselves as teachers will obviously set those expectations, but the students are also involved in complying with those expectations and hopefully meeting and exceeding them. We will look specifically at how students can play a role also in collaborating with you when it comes to the goal setting as a key component of clear expectations. So why is this important for students ultimately? It removes the guesswork, and the guesswork is where mental illness sits, like things like anxiety, particularly for students, and as we know, youth and teenage girls who are particularly predisposed to anxiety, also empowers then self-autonomy. So self-autonomy being encouraging them as their own individual agents, they're able to be feeling like they're able to contribute and know what's expected of them and know what their role is in doing so. So it takes away the ambiguity and promotes their own self-esteem, which of course is key for mental well-being. If we look back at our definition of mental well-being, it's about having a sense of presence, control, and reality. So benefits of promoting clear expectations in preventing mental illness are that students are able to know what is the task at hand right now, not next week necessarily or not next month, but what can be achieved today. Also, it helps foster a sense of control. So they're able to know, well, what can they do? What is possible? What are they able to do? Also, a sense of reality. So, what is realistically expected of them? What support is available? So, in doing so, you're able to prevent the instance of mental illness by setting clear expectations because it helps students to know that what they've got to do in the present moment, what's in their control, and also what's actually realistically possible in their own space and time. The benefits then for promoting academic excellence also are enhancing productivity and efficiency, reduces misunderstandings, and fosters accountability and motivation. So it's not just that there are psychological benefits to preventing mental illness, it's also there's academic benefits as well. So how do you actually set clear expectations? I'm going to show you a 5-part model as to how you can actually set these clear expectations, and also what to do when you're not able to set these clear expectations. So firstly, in terms of setting them, communicate the outcomes. Then you want to collaboratively set goals. As I mentioned before, it's a partnership. Then you want to break down into specific tasks and/or steps, positively reinforce progress, and encourage students to also self-praise and celebrate. So firstly, in terms of communicating the outcomes, you as teachers know way more about this than I do, but at a high level, NESA has the syllabus and the things like glossary of key terms that can really help to articulate to students what is expected of them and what are those outcomes that they're aiming to hit and that they need to hit in order to, progress and get desirable marks. So giving the students the framework, and that framework is really advantageous to help them to take away that uncertainty. Secondly, collaboratively setting goals, and you're probably all aware of SMART goals, but it's always a good framework to remind you of, and you can set these as a class in terms of, for instance, when do you want to achieve certain outcomes or syllabus points, but also individually. So what do specific students want to achieve in terms of marks, or what do they want to hand in terms of, more like accelerated or extension subjects by a certain date, time, and that sort of thing. So do that together. That doesn't necessarily have to be done by you to set goals then for the class. Thirdly, break down to specific tasks and/or steps. Again, this helps to remove that ambiguity of what's actually expected and how do we get to that desired outcome or what's expected. And then positively reinforce progress. So you may all be aware of positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. This is a bit of a 101 psychology technique. Of course, positive reinforcement is the gold standard, which means that you add or give something in order to increase behavior. So for instance, in this case, it would be praising effort and progression towards one of those goals that you've already outlined in order to increase the behaviors and desired actions that step towards that desired goal or outcome. Finally, it would be encouraging students to also self-praise and celebrate. And this is to promote not only their own internal validation and sense of well-being, but also to help them make progress towards their own goals, which is independent of you as teachers, so that you don't have to feel like you're always self-managing them. This is actually very advantageous in order to promote mental well-being, because internal validation and coming from themselves and celebrating their own successes is actually ultimately far more beneficial than necessarily just getting it from you yourself. as mentioned, what happens if you cannot set clear expectations, and appreciate that you can't always do this, particularly as the years develop and it's not necessarily that direct instruction, but you need students to come up with their own solution and ultimate delivery. For instance, probably in art, that's probably the most extreme example when they do their final work. So when you can't do that, that's okay. It's more about communicating that you don't have expectations in such a way that is as prescriptive as normal. So giving them the reassurance by saying things like, well, the whole purpose of this exercise is for you to come up with your own interpretation or your own production of the body of work. Or saying things like, I cannot tell you exactly what to do, but here's some resources that might help. So as long as they know that they themselves have access to different resources or they've got support available, and whether or not you can give those clear expectations yourself is irrelevant. It's more to help them feel and know that they're self-empowered within a framework and guidance. And finally, what Maximinds tools can you use to help you support these setting clear expectations? So as we've just looked at, here are the different steps to setting clear expectations. And I want to focus on 3 particular steps of these, which we have as tools that you can access now and download to give to students to help with this process. So starting with collaboratively setting goals with your students, as we've looked at, there are SMART goals. So I'm going to show you a video now that can help you to navigate this.
As teachers, you can guide students in setting SMART goals, which are goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. You can explain the concept of SMART goals and encourage students to set goals for their academic, personal, or social growth. Help them break down their goals into actionable steps and establish a timeline for achieving them. By setting SMART goals, students develop focus, motivation, and a sense of accomplishment, positively impacting their mental well-being.
Here is an online activity that you can also access on Maximinds for downloading for yourself to give to students, and it can give them at least a framework as to how to write them down and to give them to students. Secondly, breaking down into specific tasks and or steps. So once we know what the goals are and how they align with the ultimate outcomes that you need to and want to achieve as teachers, what are the different tools you can use in this case? Firstly, I think it's about really breaking up what students have to work towards in a daily, weekly, and monthly context. This, of course, helps them to feel more a sense of in control as to what they can do actually each day versus each week versus each month. And this is just a framework. You could use this over a different period of time if you like. But this at least helps them to focus on what are their priorities and how they can each day, for instance, work towards that goal versus each week versus each month. So again, I'll show you a tool that how this works.
As teachers, you can emphasize the significance of routines in maintaining mental well-being. Ask them to take a moment to write down their daily tasks, the things they need to do regularly. It could be as simple as eating meals at regular times, exercising, or making their bed. Then ask them to consider their weekly tasks, like chores such as cleaning their room or walking the dog. Finally, ask them to consider their monthly tasks that contribute to their overall well-being, such as engaging in a hobby or planning something special. Organising tasks in different timeframes help them feel more in control and give structure to their life. By following a routine, it establishes healthy habits, reduces stress, and creates a sense of stability and productivity, which are all crucial for maintaining their mental well-being.
And again, here is a template that you could use to help them as students to work out what they actually have to achieve on those different timelines. As we know, focusing on what they can do each day is just as important then as taking that longer term perspective as to what can be achieved each week versus each month. So another great preventative tool for mental wellbeing. And also in terms of that breaking down tasks and steps, when you're actually in the classroom and there's a specific task at hand for you to tackle, breaking down into one big thing, 3 smaller, medium things, and 5 smaller things can really help to compartmentalize what's most crucial and help them to prioritize. And again, gives them a bit more of a checklist and focus on what's in their control to tick off. So I'll show that one to you.
Students often feel overwhelmed by the tasks they need to complete. As teachers, you can help them overcome this by breaking down tasks into smaller, more manageable parts. Encourage students to create a list of 1 big task, 3 medium-sized tasks, and 5 smaller tasks for the day. By doing this, students can feel more in control and confident in managing their workload, leading to improved mental well-being. Students.
And again, here is a downloadable if you would like to save and print that to give to students to help them when they're overwhelmed or have that more anxious or stressed tendencies, to break down into, okay, what can actually be achieved, and the boxes to help them tick off as we all like to, knowing what we've actually achieved in the process of getting to that ultimate big goal of, for instance, finishing their English essay. So what needs to happen as a medium task is getting their 3 thesis points, and the 5 might be getting, 5+ quotes, for instance. So just helping them on 1 page to break it down. These are all great preventative tools to help them, make them feel that they can have that autonomy and power over what has to be achieved, and make sure that they don't feel too overwhelmed. And then finally, in terms of setting clear expectations, encouraging students to self-praise and celebrate. And we looked at this as very important in terms of helping them foster that internal validation rather than just you praising them and giving them that positive reinforcement. Definitely helps not only immediately, but that long-term enduring motivation. So another technique that we will look at is focusing on not only what they have to do, but what they have achieved. And this you could give, for instance, at the start of every lesson, at the end. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the morning and at night, but more thinking about what do they have to do and what they have done.
We all know about to-do lists in the morning. It's great to create a to-do list to prioritize your task for the day. However, it is equally important for a to-do list. Prompt your students at the end of each day to identify and write down 3 things they achieved or are proud of. This practice helps students recognize their efforts, boosts self-esteem, and reinforces a positive mindset. This practice shifts your focus from what's left undone to what they've already achieved. It fosters a sense of accomplishment, gratitude, satisfaction, and promotes mental well-being.
And here, again, for you is a downloadable if you'd like to do that. That's available to you online to help at least structure that on paper, which we know is always good for preventing mental well-being, of course, mental illness, but also fostering mental well-being both in the moment and ongoing. And finally, a summary. So what did we hopefully learn about today? Prevention is reducing the incidence of mental illness, but also increasing the actions taken to help students to remain healthy. Prevention is important as it can reduce the incidence of suicide as ultimately the worst case scenario. It can also result in academic benefits for you as teachers, but also proactive rather than reactive is important in order to avoid those crises moments. Mental illness in students can be prevented by educating yourself on mental health and mental illness, learning to identify warning signs of mental illness, developing that rapport and strong connections with your students, and finally, encouraging your own self-awareness and fostering an authoritative teaching style. As one preventative technique, clear expectations are ensuring comprehensible, easy to understand, student-tailored goals, outcomes, and end products to remove that guesswork and also empower self-autonomy in students. You personally as teachers can set clear expectations by communicating the outcomes, collaboratively setting goals, breaking down outcomes into specific tasks and steps, positively reinforcing their progress and encouraging students to self-praise and celebrate. You can make use of all the Maximize tools that we've looked at today, but above and beyond those, but including those today are SMART goals, routine tasks and bite-sized tasks, but also the to-do and to-da, and they are all available to you online. If you wouldn't mind, please scanning the QR code. There is a couple of quick questions. It should take you 20 seconds. I'll just give you some time now. And finally, resources. As always, here are your emergency contacts. You have 3 months unlimited free access to Maximize with those strategies, videos, and activities we explored today. But in addition to that, different quizzes, articles, and the option to refer to a psychologist. So please feel free to make use of that. And finally, here are my contact details and a QR code to scan access Maximize. Thank you for attending week 7 and see you next week.